We acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of the Gunai-Kurnai Nation and that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
We acknowledge that we benefit from the colonial structures and policies that remain in place today. We stand in solidarity with First Nations people and recognise the ongoing process of dismantling those structures.
During the First World War, strikes caused fuel shortages so severe that the Victorian Government reopened the old brown coal mine near Morwell in the Latrobe Valley.
And the state government has outlined a long-term plan to ensure the Latrobe Valley remains viable as its economy moves away from coal-fired energy.
It's been the lifeblood of the Latrobe Valley for decades, but continual change in the power industry and the introduction of the carbon tax means it's time for a plan B.
It's a month tomorrow since fire entered the Hazelwood coal mine in Victoria's east.
Fire has been burning for weeks now, blanketing the township in a toxic smoke. The housing estates are literally just 50 metres away, so when the wind blows in the other direction, they take all of that in.
The guillotine has finally come down on Australia's dirtiest power station, Hazelwood. It's caused jitters about electricity prices and raised questions about Australia's readiness for a low-carbon future.
We're not going to achieve net zero in the cafes, dinner parties and wine bars of our inner cities.
The Latrobe Valley's coal mines could be filled with water and made into a tourist attraction to rival Italy's Lake Como.
So last episode we covered 4.5 billion years in an hour. It was a bit of a head spin from dinosaurs, our areas of First Nations history. We learnt about prehistoric trees that led to the formation of coal and all of that coaly good stuff. This week I took over the research journey and we are in our 20th century history era. We're going to be looking at the possible misnomer about the golden age of coal, which is when the Latrobe Valley literally powered Victoria. And then we asked the question, golden for whomst? So we're going to find out. So Steph, I don't know if you think a lot about golden ages, but when I say golden age of coal, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I do. I think a lot about the golden age of the valley. And for me, it takes me back to, I don't know, my tutukas and my dad always talking about how we had these incredible shops, like all the shops were full, people had money to spend, the SEC were contributing financially to like the building of the hospital and things like that. We had these incredible houses that were popping up to house the migrant workers who came to work in the coal mines and in the power stations. And it makes me think of the Purvis family. The Purvis family have a mall named after them. Purvis Plaza.
I mean, that's the dream, isn't it? Like, you've got Melanie's Mall, you've got the Purvis Plaza Mall. Like, to have a mall named after you is kind of like making it, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And like this family, they were responsible for a lot of the the rag trade boom during the golden age of coal, and they had a lot of shops that were named after them. Like the Purvis Plaza has just gone under a revamp because it was full of asbestos. But I have this book called Purvis for Service, and it kind of goes through that history of the Purvis family and all of the shops that they had put in. They were like the first big shop in the valley to get those tubes that suck up the money from the register.
Oh my God, thematic, what are they called? I'm
not
tubes?
Sure. Yeah, something like that. But they got those tubes, so they'd have these beautiful checkout women. There was no men working at the checkout. They'd, close up their till and put the money up the tube, and it would get sucked up the back room. It's kind of what the golden age makes me think of. And also, like, I've got these great postcards of Morwell from back in this time period as well. And everyone had a nice car, and everyone was dressed really well, and there was no empty shop fronts like we see now. So that's kind of what the golden age makes me think of, when there was like a lot of possibility and a lot of opportunity and a lot of places to spend your dough.
I think like just you talking about like the set hair, like my nana would go down and get her hair set every week, and that was just the standard. Like you had to kind of like have your face on, do all this sort of like social life stuff that I feel like I don't understand or can't really relate to. But that golden age where maybe sort of what you're mentioning is like that element of modernity, like you were describing stuff that's basically like futurism. And it did feel like for a while there, or at least from the research I've done, that obviously there are people who the golden age like didn't really benefit, but and we'll talk about that a bit more later. But for those that were riding the wave of the energy revolution, which was sort of really hitting its strides in that 1920s onwards when they started actually supplying electricity to Melbourne. The money that came to the area, the growth spurt, people were thriving. Well, many people were thriving, some people weren't. I always feel like we've lived in like the shadow of that. People would talk about it like it was that, and then we were very much aware that it was no longer that. Like, that's kind of how I experienced it. Everyone would talk about how it used to be, which is kind of part of what I feel like golden ages are too. Like, I don't think I've ever lived in a golden age. I've always just heard about golden ages and wished that I was in them, like, instead.
For sure. And to your point about getting your hair done, etc. Like, I've got these amazing photos of my Tutukas and his workmates in like a full 3-piece suit in the coal mine, like having smoko and eating their lunch in suits. There wasn't even a work, like they weren't even in overalls.
We kind of carved up history and gave ourselves the tasks of researching certain parts. So when I kind of got this early part, which I knew very little about, I'd mostly just heard about it anecdotally. I think I mostly had been familiar with sort of more like post-war stuff where like my opa was working in the power stations and stuff. So I really didn't know that much about how quickly our area expanded. So when I started digging into this time from about the 1920s onwards, after the initial power stations were built and supplying electricity to the city, the golden age concept sort of kept coming up, and not all the time, but certainly it was something that had been referenced to. And I think maybe it's more anecdotally something that I'd been sort of told growing up. So like, it's kind of part of the myth of if you grow up in an energy producing family, there was sort of like a reference or a harken back to it being this halcyon time or this better time. I thought it would be interesting as just like a sort of sidebar, just to dig into critically what a golden age actually is. Obviously it sounds great. You're like, golden age, that must be good. But I wanted to just quickly dig into the history of like what we even mean when we say that. So I'm going to send you some text. It's a definition. I'm going to get you to read it for us.
Golden age, the plural noun, golden ages. An idyllic, often imaginary pastime of peace, prosperity, and happiness.
The idyllicism and the imaginary part. Like, I thought that golden age was not, I had assumed that there was like some critique to be had, but I didn't really realize that it baked into it was the imaginary element. Did you know that?
Well, I didn't, but it makes a lot of sense when I think of the post-war history, like the 1950s on. There's this imaginary perfect time of the nuclear family, et cetera, and it wasn't a good time for everyone. Like, housewives were getting addicted to Valium. So that definitely, that embodies the imaginary pastime of the peace and prosperity and happiness to me.
I don't know if we're more class conscious, but it certainly feels like we've been criticizing and analyzing the 1950s like our whole lives in terms of a period. But now looking even further back, these tendrils are just so deeply lain within our like society and community, and we're still sort of like dealing with the ramifications of this stuff. So history always just makes more complex history. Like, the deeper we dig, the more I'm like, oh my god, everything is so fucking interrelated. But the term golden age is actually derived from where many good things are derived, Greek mythology. It's from a poem called The Works and Days by a bloke named Hesiod, probably butchering that, and it has a section about the myth of the ages where he outlines the ages of humankind. So there's the golden age, silver age, bronze age, heroic age, and the present age, which is that of iron. Golden ages are considered to be the peak time in history or of a nation or of people. So it's always had this sort of like metaphorical use. So no one was sort of, oh, there's literally people who are like golden and better, but it's sort of a way to refer back to a way to discuss civilizational rises and declines. History gets kind of reduced down to these like quite simplistic phrases, and most of the time, who has the time to like think through all of the nuance? And I'm really interested in like, and I know we both are, the way that transition sucks open these voids and holes, the way that things kind of move quite quickly within these spaces.
It makes me think too how we're losing that middle class of folks. We're having this massive disparity with wealth. So it is very much the golden age for whom?
The golden age for whom? So that's our central theme, in case you're playing Spark Notes at home. So I don't want to keep using the digging in pun, but as I was digging into this research, I kept coming across the work of Professor Erik Eklund. So Erik is an honorary professor of history at the Australian National University, and he also lived and worked here in Gippsland for over a decade. Where else do you start but to Google things? So I was Googling workers' lives in 20th century Gippsland, and Erik's book, Earth and Industry, Stories from Gippsland, which he co-wrote with Julie Fenley, kept coming up. Erik's written about mining towns in Newcastle, Port Kembla, and he's also really fascinated with worker history through the lens of labour, and he writes a lot about people and places outside of the mainstream story. So yeah, I managed to dig up a copy of the book. I was blown away, honestly, with just like the depth of the stories that had been uncovered. And as someone who grew up in the valley, there were stories in here that I had no idea about in terms of expanding my understanding of what the valley was like during that time. I wrote to Erik and he actually agreed to speak with me. And so on a super cold day in August, we had a conversation about the lives of workers in the earliest 20th century, what the valley was like. We spoke about classism and, most importantly, his favourite landmark in Gippsland. Erik is the honorary professor at ANU. He's got his PhD from Sydney University in history, and he worked at Monash, Fed Uni, and has won multiple awards from the Victorian Community History Awards and the New South Wales Premier History Award. So he's quite fancy. To start and sort of set the scene, I asked how he became so interested, because I don't think typically people are like, oh, let me study this really random place in the middle of nowhere in Australia. Like, that's what I want to be doing. So I asked Erik how he got interested in this workers' lives and histories in the first place.
Over quite a few years now, I've been working mostly in regional Australia, often with mining and industrial towns and regions, resource communities, and I have a fascination for their history. I feel like they're often overlooked in sort of very capital city dominated narratives of national progress. So everywhere I've lived, I've sort of tried to engage in the sort of regional milieu. I was based in the University of Newcastle for many years and got involved in Newcastle and Hunter Valley history. On going to Gippsland and working at the Gippsland campus there, it seemed like the obvious thing to do because it was such a distinctive region with a history that really wasn't well known really outside of Gippsland.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. It's incredible that Erik got to work in the Hunter Valley and in Newcastle. I'm also fascinated with the history of those regions. That, yeah, he's really very right about the narratives of national progress being city dominated, because
yes,
yeah, so many people don't even know where the Latrobe Valley is or anything about where the power comes from here. And I'm sure that that's the same around Australia too.
I had an idea of what I thought that early turn of the century stuff would be like, and it was certainly, largely framed by like TV and movie, but not really from Australia, right? Like I rarely watch or was able to enjoy media about that period here, but I haven't really seen anything specifically about Gippsland. So I wanted to know from a literal historian, what was it like at that turn of the century into that energy boom? And also I wanted to get Erik's take on the Golden Age question. It keeps being referred to like this, but what does that actually mean to someone who's studied it in depth? And this is what Erik had to say.
Gippsland is a very unusual region. Geographically speaking, it's for European colonists, it was quite difficult to access. So it developed in a very scattered way from a non-Indigenous perspective. And it really wasn't until the 1880s that there was serious attention to this extensive brown coal deposit, which, underlies much of the Gippsland Basin. And like in world terms, it's a pretty extraordinary resource. It's 25% of the global resources of known brown coal. The challenge was, well, how do you sort of convert that into energy? How do you use that to try and power a kind of a settler economy, which was emerging in that period? There was a coal mine set up just south of the Latrobe River in 1889. That was the Great Morwell Mine, and they were basically mining brown coal. But brown coal is different to black coal. It has some technical limitations. It has some engineering challenges to convert it into energy. It wasn't a straightforward process. And so a lot of Gippsland history is about dealing with engineering challenges and confronting them and trying to solve them. In particular, looking at places like Germany and the Ruhr Valley, which also has brown coal deposits. And so there's a lot of toing and froing between Germany and the Ruhr Valley experts there by the beginning of the 20th century. And it's really at the end of the First World War, so 1917, 1918, the Victorian Government is kind of sick of relying on New South Wales black coal. There were a couple of major industrial disputes. At that time, coal kind of powered the economy, it powered the transport system, the railways, and it was the major aspect for domestic heating. So it was a pretty crucial resource. So the decision was taken to try and standardise coal acquisition and electricity supply by forming the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, the SECV. By 1920, 1921, the SECV was in place. Sir John Monash, the general from First World War fame, was installed initially as general manager, and later he became commissioner, I think. And it was Monash that kind of oversaw the development of the brown coal resource from the 20s onwards. You could probably say there were two golden ages. It came with a cost. The first golden age probably dated from the middle of the 1920s, and that's when Yallourn A comes online, the first power station at the Yallourn open cut. And there's significant economic development and growth that flows from that. And I think in 1924 was when Yallourn first supplied electricity into the Melbourne market. If you look at the population figures for somewhere like Morwell, there's 2,000 people in Morwell in 1921. But by the end of that decade, Morwell's pushing up to 7,000. So the growth at Morwell is really quite important. And of course there are other satellite towns growing as well, including Yallourn itself, which was sited just outside of the deposit within, well, allegedly just outside the brown coal deposit at the Yallourn open cut. So that's probably the first golden age, where you had Yallourn A, B and C, and D and E produced and coming online from the 1920s.
I guess what I really took from that clip is hearing that we have been working with Germany and the Ruhr Valley since like the 20th century. So I think it's wild to me. I kind of thought the relationship developed as a result of having to do mine rehabilitation that was similar. But the fact that we've been connecting with those communities abroad for that time to try and troubleshoot our coal is really extremely interesting.
I love that framework of it being like the engineering challenges to overcome and solve. You know, we've learnt before about the difference between lignite brown coal and like this much fancier, better black coal. I didn't realize how much those challenges created the specific context that we're now living in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what too surprised me is the population growth from Morwell.
Yes.
Like he said, 2,000 people. So in the 2021 census, there was 14,389 people in Morwell. So like that's a massive growth since then. And I don't know what it would have been in the 50s when my post-war migration was starting.
13,000.
Whoa, yeah, 13,000.
Yeah.
So that's like a huge gap. And another way that we can say we've got Immigration Park in Morwell, but migrants like literally built this area.
Yeah. I was interested in the scale of Morwell too. So it went from 2,000 in the 1920s. Okay, so the 1930s, it went up to 7,000 people. So kind of like tripled in size. By the 50s, it was 13,000. And then this is crazy because I didn't realize it got this big. In 1991, it was 26,000 people. Isn't that crazy?
That's pre-privatization. And
yes. That's like kind of peak worker. So it's dropped. It's basically like, was that
half?
It's like around halved from its peak. Yeah. So we've kind of gone through these cycles of boom and bust. But that's why in Morwell you can see the empty shops. There's clearly abandoned homes. You can kind of feel the contraction. You can kind of feel the remnants of the golden age. There are still some grand buildings, the elements of when it was much bigger, but it's quite clearly been a very long time. Erik outlined that he felt like there's kind of two golden ages. The first one is that initial push in 1920 when they start connecting the power to the city, and Morwell's identity and growth kind of shifts from being this little settlement to a huge energy generating area. And then he sort of outlines that the second golden age is post-war. I asked what that was like and how community kind of responded to that huge growth. So this is what Erik had to say about that.
The second golden age for coal in the Latrobe Valley is the post-Second World War period. And this sees some of the older Yallourn units demolished and new ones put in, and eventually the Hazelwood power station is constructed and comes online. All 8 units are online by 1971 from memory. There were more ambitious plans, but they stuck with just an expansion of Hazelwood. And I think the post-war period, you also have large numbers of migrant workers coming into places like Yallourn and Newborough, Moe and Morwell. So these are bustling, culturally diverse towns which are also generating good working class wages and income. So one of the things about the SEC was that it had a sort of a technical, professional and engineering workforce that were reasonably well paid in terms of working class people, and that was supplemented by shift work. And here's where we get to some of the downsides. The 24-hour production cycle did take a toll on, for the most part, men, but not always, who took on shift work. It plays havoc with your normal circadian rhythms. But also the other side of the boom, of course, is growing amounts of exposure to a range of industrial pollutants. If you talk to people in the region, they talk about the way the creeks and the rivers began to decline in the water quality, the loss of swimming holes, the loss of fishing opportunities. So there was tremendous growth in those 2 periods and lots of opportunities, and there were good wages being earned, particularly by men in that industry. But at the same time, there was a environmental cost, and a lot of people, were sad about that too.
Wow, that is really fascinating.
Environmentalism mentioned.
Yeah, environmentalism mentioned as well. But what really struck me from that is that there was all 8 units were online in 1971, and then they make more. They just expanded Hazelwood, which I don't think I'd heard about that before. And I think one of the other phrases that he used is good working class wages and income.
Yeah.
And that, the SEC and unions would have had a hell of a lot to do with getting good working class wages.
Well, that's what it makes me think that the flip side of a golden age is who is doing the actual fucking work to make that happen. And we all kind of have a sense that it's not uncommon for people to die in their 50s and 60s having worked like a manual labour or coal kind of job.
Yeah.
Like that feels quite
or
common.
not even to die, just to be unable to work any longer. As well. So to have become disabled in some way that takes out a lot of the working life. So it is, I think, really important to remember that it's blood money in a lot of ways.
There's a cost. About maybe 5 years ago now, I got a chance to go in and document my dad in Yallourn, and that power station is the same one from the 1970s. Like, that's why it has so many issues, and it not only is it like stepping into like a completely another world, but it's also like clearly an super aging building just in terms of its structural integrity. I was honestly shocked at the dust and dirt. It's constantly moist because of the steam, like just the actual conditions. It feels like something from a much older, and I guess it is from a much older period of time, but there are still men and women and people working in those conditions. Yes, maybe they get a decent wage, but in terms of the consequences to their health, their knees, their backs, their physical health, it's still literally backbreaking kind of work that is going on just to keep the lights on for all of us here in this state. Even though this is all talking about sort of much more retrospective period, those conditions are basically still happening. There are still people literally getting on their hands and knees, fucking welding shit in a dripping, dusty, spider covered hole to like make us have electricity.
I think from when I remember when you went and did that, and some of the graffiti that you spoke about really blew my mind in there, and also the sound of the power station. Like we spoke about that in the last episode, that you can hear it in the distance, but it's so spooky in there
because I recorded, I think, in there, and I've never used that footage for anything. So maybe I'll see if I can dig up the drone. But basically, Steph's talking about the drone kind of hum of the machinery. It's hot in there because these fucking generators are literally generating electricity, but it's hot and steamy, and there's this like weird clanky drone sound. And also, yeah, you're right, I forgot about the graffiti till you just mentioned it, but there was like signs of life of humans, either etched their names or written little funny things or just put their markings around these spaces. Like we'll put it on Instagram so you guys can see too. But so I thought, given that Erik sort of talked about the places, and we're both kind of fascinated with the buildings and how these areas sort of came to be, and the way that the energy consumption kind of shapes our environment. On that sort of planning topic and the powers that be. I was curious from Erik's like sort of studied perspective, how did they see Latrobe Valley? I'd kind of always assumed that it kind of was a bit haphazard because the coal was there, but I wanted to better understand that sort of concept of like, we've got this energy underneath our feet. Is that something that the powers that be at the time in the state were planning for? And how preordained was that like power hub concept by state planners? So this is what Erik had to say about that.
Cheap energy was supposed to drive Victoria's industrialisation, and in many ways it did. A lot of industries were set up on the back of the provision of brown coal generated industry, like the aluminium smelters, for example. So yeah, that was the vision. It was a very much a kind of a modernist ideal that energy and rational production would generate all of these opportunities and the whole state would benefit. But it was also, in a sense, quite a sort of a technical and sort of dehumanised vision as well. So the SEC was very much controlled from Melbourne and by Melbourne. And so there was very little room for a kind of local participation or engagement. The things that sort of take for granted now, opportunities to be consulted and to have our say, really didn't come about until the late 60s and early 70s. And by that stage, the SEC was a sort of dominant force because it was so economically powerful in the region. What they wanted, they tended to get. The SEC's vision for the Latrobe Valley, how the towns would be divided, whether Yallourn would, survive or whether it would be destroyed, where Churchill would be sited, they're all very much in the hands of the decision makers at SEC. And so in that sense, I think that encouraged or created a sort of a sense of alienation from control and agency over your future. And there was a sense that local people weren't able to have an input into all of these momentous changes going on.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. I really think that, the attitude of things being controlled from Melbourne, by Melbourne, for Melbourne, still very much exists in the Valley today. And it's fascinating to see that it was actually happening up till the 60s and the 70s and things like that. The idea that it was just going to be beyond the coal industries to be, with aluminium smelters and other sorts of heavy industry. This is literally like the place in The Sims where you throw all your dirty industry.
As soon as I heard him call it like dehumanized, I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to hear it. That, because I also feel like we have such an expectation today of this like participatory
consultation
way of doing consultation. Yeah, you're right. I guess I was shocked to hear so recently that we weren't doing that at all. Like I guess I didn't grasp that this was so new in terms of our expectations. I expect it now, and I'm fucked off when it doesn't happen properly.
Yeah, I did kind of know. I did know that it was more a thing with the renewable industry that had to go through this stringent processing, but also with other industry, there has been an opportunity, to put feedback into the government about like for town planning and things like that. But I didn't realise, like you said, that it was none. It was just literally figureheads deciding. And I think that's why I get so upset at the idea of the consultation fatigue as well. I don't know, no one's getting consultation fatigue if they're being listened to the first time, sort of thing. Or
having what they say implemented. I think that's where I'm like frustrated. It's we've been saying the same things for like apparently fucking 100 years. If we just implemented some of them, maybe then people wouldn't be so fatigued about it.
Yeah, or were honest about why it couldn't happen as well.
Yes. Right.
So, but yeah, that's a whole other episode.
Steph, I want to take you on we're going on a sidebar. Okay, get ready. Ooh. Lock in. We're going to a different place now. We've not talked about, I'm going to say it, Churchill very much on this podcast. So I was hoping you might be able to describe like the Valley's kind of like rough layout and what Churchill's like, its location and what you kind of know of that town.
Okay, well, if you want me to talk in terms of north, south, east, and west, I don't know. But
no, we don't have to get technical.
Yeah, let's not get too technical. But I've always personally thought of Churchill as a university town because that's what it's always been. Churchill had like Monash Uni, but I know in the 70s there was like a thriving arts department and it was like a thriving campus. So I've always thought of the community popping up to support the university. It wasn't until quite recently, like last year, that I found out it was like a company town for mining. So that blew my mind. As you're driving out to Churchill, there's like the thing that strikes me about the drive is, one, there's a lot of like little industrial kind of pop-ups that I have no idea what they're for. There's a lot of farmland and there's also a lot of crosses on the side of the road because a lot of people have been killed on driving on that road. And then when you drive into the town of Churchill, to the left is like the university. The university's kind of in this like pocket of lush greenery off the side of like this rounded sort of lake. Outside of the uni, on the other side of the road, there's a lot of houses. Like they don't look kind of like your lawn housey. There's a lot of brick homes, but yeah, a lot of different style homes. And then there's like the little town centre that had like an IGA and a video shop and an op shop and a petrol station, and that was about it. Fun fact about Churchill, they currently don't have a public toilet. So a public toilet, yeah, you definitely need a public toilet. So council, thank gosh, has finally approved a public toilet for Churchill. And there was also this little pub, which was weird, which is like a little saloon style thing. After that, the pub is kind of the last shop out of town.
Yeah.
And then it goes up towards the Geraldines, and it's this beautiful bushland, and there's lots of like Jehovah's Witnesses churches and things like that out there.
Oh, those hills there's some choices being made in those hills, you know?
There is a lot of God.
So you're so right. Like it literally was built as a company town, but get this, it was not even started construction until 1965. So it's real recent. They built it specifically as a service centre for Hazelwood Power Station, and those houses that you were describing, the reason that they look like that is because they were literally built as workers' houses for the folks who were going to be working in Hazelwood. So that's kind of why it's got that sort of uniform kind of feel to it. Erik, I was curious about, like, because he specifically looks at how place impacts people and specifically how industrialization shapes our area. So he's going to speak a little bit about Newborough, where I used to live, and then Churchill, where you used to live. So this is what Erik said about how industrialization shaped where we live.
You could look at a couple of examples there. One is the subdivisions at Newborough. Old Newborough tended to be the old settlement that was sort of there in the late colonial period, but the other parts of Newborough are really subdivisions that were created by the SEC. They included, sort of prefabricated homes and so on. So that was seen to be like a dormitory suburb for a lot of the workers in the industry. That was, I guess, the first iteration, which sort of dated from the early 1950s. So again, you can look at the population figures for Newborough. It grows quite rapidly. And the other example is Churchill itself, which was like a model town designed from the ground up in the early 1960s by a Department of Housing architect. And it was very nicely located on a rise overlooking the valley. It was located in a way that it wouldn't be downwind from a lot of the prevailing toxic fumes, etc., and smoke plumes that are coming out of Hazelwood. So it was quite a decent place to live. You can see that now if you go to Churchill and drive around and look at the parks. It's essentially a garden suburb sort of planning ideal. Lots of walking tracks, open green space, and originally called Hazelwood. There was a plan to change the name, which was very controversial at the time, but eventually changed to Churchill, I think in 65 or 66. So the first few residents are moving into those Department of Housing provided homes. And the thing about Churchill, which marked it out as this great modernist dream, apart from the open green space, was the fact that there was no fibro. It would be a brick town. So if you look at the old, what are now old Department of Housing homes along Switchback Road there, they're all brick. And that marked Churchill out as this sort of planned modernist paradise. To top it all off, I guess, was the Hazelwood pondage. And that was a beautiful example of how industry, where form and function also enable a kind of a leisure and a leisure opportunities. You know, you could go sailing in the warm waters of the pondage. And I was lucky enough to live in Churchill for a little while. And I know lots of Churchill residents have fond memories of the pondage, because while it was performing an industrial function for Hazelwood Power Station, it was providing, leisure opportunities for Churchill residents.
Okay, there are so many amazing things that Erik has said in that clip. Like Churchill is a planned modernist paradise. And I'm glad it isn't just me. He said there's no fibro houses there as well. And that's the word I was kind of looking for when I was speaking before about...
Morwell's filled with those, right?
Yeah, filled with those. And so's Moe. Also, he said that it was located somewhere that it wouldn't be downwind from the prevailing toxic fumes. How kind
Not
of them.
Not like Morwell.
Not like Morwell, no.
When you were growing up, was the Hazelwood pondage considered good to go swimming, or was it a bit sus? Because I feel like by the time I was like swimming around, it was like you're going to get an ear infection. It wasn't necessarily a good idea to swim in that thing, even though we did.
I think that, because I went to a lot of the, SEC picnics and stuff growing up, that it was fine. It wasn't really an issue that was raised.
For people who don't know, a pondage, or Hazelwood pondage specifically, so all these power stations obviously need to put their hot water somewhere. So basically they have these things called cooling ponds. Yeah. They have cooling ponds that get progressively cooler. So the first one's steaming, can't swim in it, and then there's maybe 2 or 3 that are like that are just too hot. But by the time it gets to, in this case, the Hazelwood pondage, you can swim in it, but the closer you are to the power station, the hotter you are in the water. So most people would swim, a bit further up the shore, so it's not openly hot. But it also did mean that down the line, as climate change became more of a thing, we would get bursts of, I think it was blue-green algae, I have to double check that, but we would get algae blooms and the water would be a bit nasty, not great soup really. So I think anytime I hear about this kind of modernist fantasy, which absolutely love, I also watch too many movies about cyberpunk issues, so I cannot not think about classism. So I was wondering who was left behind and what class distinctions emerged. So this is what Erik had to say about classism.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things going on, across the 20th century. There's some pre-existing divisions within the local workforce, often between those who had permanent positions or positions that were seen to be respectable work. They might be storekeepers, or they might be accountants or engineers, versus the vast majority of working class men, for example, in the early 20th century, tended to have work that wasn't guaranteed. It tended to be highly casualised. Now, when they could get work, sometimes the pay was okay, but the problem was permanency. So some of the railway jobs were really coveted because they were permanent jobs. You could guarantee if you turned up, you were working that day on a railway job. So some of those divisions within the labour market tended to play out through the new SEC workforce between the staffers, those that were, perhaps had a professional or technical education, or they were accountants and were less likely to be members of a union, versus the men that were fitter and turners or engine drivers or just overseeing the boilers or working around the plant. They tended to be union members and they tended to be wage workers. And some of the companies that eventually ended up taking over the privatised, or corporatised and privatised power station inadvertently sort of emphasised those divisions by giving workers, different coloured overalls and different coloured hats and so on. So you could see a mile away, what someone's position was in the labour hierarchy simply by the colour of their safety helmet.
That is really, really interesting that the casualised workplace has been a problem for so long. I feel that it's become more apparent across industries. Really interesting that the working class jobs were not guaranteed and extremely casualised. I think another thing that struck me was the professional and technical education and accountants and things were less likely to be union members, which makes sense when you think about it, because I guess those are not as dangerous jobs. So there's maybe less things. I think everyone should join their union wherever they are, but maybe there's less things for the union to do in those spaces. And also the different coloured uniforms and overalls.
Yeah. I also feel like this is where you kind of start to expand like the kinds of supply chain that is connected to the energy market and like all the other things that have to be in town in order to facilitate the energy production. I was going to say, so basically around this time in the conversation, it took a real shift. So when I speak to people like Erik, I'm always kind of, because, you know, they're so well researched and they've done so much study over their lives. And obviously he's connected with just all sorts of different areas that have gone through similar but divergent, I guess, journeys. I like to ask kind of like a broad question of like, you know, what's the most colourful story or whatever that you've found during your research or conversations? And this is kind of where he told me something that I had no idea that we were known for, but Gippsland actually has a really prominent role in early environmental activism in that nascent sort of development of like Morwell National Park. I had no idea that that was the case. So Erik's going to describe for us now Gippsland's, I think, kind of underknown role in the burgeoning environmental movement.
One thing I would say, and it may not be well known outside the region, is that the very utilitarian, hard-nosed view of the Latrobe Valley was that it was all about, you know, coal mining on a gigantic scale and generating energy on an equally gigantic scale. But I've sort of increasingly become aware of some of the aspects of Gippsland history which kind of don't get so well represented. And one, I think, is a sort of a nascent environmental movement which sort of emerged in the 50s and 60s, particularly through the Bushwalkers Club and the Naturalist Club, Latrobe Valley Naturalist Club. These were people that were interested in the natural environment, were witnessing great change around them. And I've got to say that for the most part they welcomed the change. They said, well, this is great. But they wanted to moderate and mediate the impact of that change. One example is the formation of the Morwell National Park, and many locals will know the park, and it's a great place to visit. Now, that came about through the initiative of people from the Naturalist Club, and it's an unusual national park in that it wasn't all Crown land. It was actually land in private hands, and some of the owners, one in particular from the Quigley family, who are well known around the Churchill area, a farmer who, by the name of Quigley, who was very keen to preserve that area. And it was Quigley's block that formed the basis of the Morwell National Park in 65, I think. And so you can see what's really fascinating is that what's going on is this kind of up-to-date planning experiment with the production of a new town, Churchill. And just up the road, you've got people setting aside land for conservation of birds and rare flowers, which are common throughout Morwell National Park. There's some rare orchids there, apparently. So I'm told. I've never seen them myself. And at the same time, you have kind of experiments in Churchill itself, like the formation of the Gippsland Institute for Education. Like, we have this image of Gippsland as, you know, sort of bringing up the rear, you know, doing the plodding industrial work. But in fact, culturally, it's actually cutting edge. And I think that often you find innovation exists and thrives on the peripheries in places where people are not looking or they don't care so much. And so communities can do some great things, whether it's setting up a national park, whether it's building an institute for education, which had a really remarkable distance education model, and bringing a lot of new jobs into the region and giving opportunities for locals to go and do higher education. I think there are those themes in Gippsland history that, yeah, we shouldn't forget.
I don't know if we had like a cultural rift or like a kind of history gap or something. Maybe it was just like us specifically not paying attention, but it feels like, because we've also run into like arts communities from sort of more like the 60s, 70s era, that it's like you wouldn't know that they're there until you really, really dug into it. I feel like there's kind of like like a missing link somehow. Again, that could just be my naivety, but I genuinely didn't know that Gippsland had this role. It's not that either of us are not interested in environmentalism or like the naturalist movement. Like, I feel like those are all things I've like read and looked into, but I hadn't really come across the fact that Gippsland had played that role. But when you think about the geography and like you were describing, like we've got, yes, the giant scars and coaly bit in the middle of the valley, but all the edges are like this incredible forest land. And there are folks living in like almost off-grid, or there are off-grid folks living up there. It never connected for me that like they were part of like a broader movement.
Yeah, my dad talks about that. Like there was like a hobby farm boom around in the 60s and the 70s.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
was
it
a
like
lot of
self-sustainability?
Thing. And that's kind of why my like Tatukas and why my parents like bought like a hobby farm size block. And my dad always talks about how heaps of people from the uni were doing that at the time, and also about like the cooperatives and things that were around during that era too. So they had like a cooperative food bank thing where everyone had, you know, put in money and get a box of veggies. That's kind of largely died out.
Yeah, maybe that 80s and 90s like pure capitalism, greed. We're aware of these things when I like look at movies and books. I failed to overlay that to our own area, but yeah, just it makes me really appreciate the work that has been laid before us. On the same sort of context, given that Erik had like researched across other mining towns, I always like to think of us as different, unique, special in Gippsland. But I was curious about like what we could understand about Gippsland specifically in terms of the common ground that we share with other mining regions. But then I was also thinking to ask him like, what sets us apart? Is there anything that is unique? Because it feels like it's unique, but I also know that that might just be my like bias thinking that we're special. So this is what Erik had to say about what sets us apart, but also what common ground we share with other mining communities.
What sets it apart is, unlike some other resource communities, it's geographically more complex. So it doesn't have a single town centre or industrial centre. That makes it a bit more interesting, but it also makes it more difficult to build that sort of unified voice that we talked about earlier. If you compare it to some other places that have undergone a sort of transition from industrial to post-industrial, probably my biggest frustration when I was living in the region was that the region's history and heritage wasn't seen to be one of its most powerful and important assets. I felt like the approach to heritage was cavalier. You know, that people were quite keen to destroy stuff, and almost like we wanted a blank slate and start again. And I think if I compare that to other regions like the Ruhr Valley in Germany, like Queenstown in Tasmania, or Broken Hill in far western New South Wales, these are places that have embraced their heritage, have embraced their history and their identity as resource communities, and then have segued that into some post-industrial future, whether it's through art and craft, whether it's through repurposing. You know, I've been into power stations which are repurposed as art spaces. And, you know, the frustration for me was that people kept telling us, no, that can't happen. No, it can't happen. And almost like the problem was that no one wanted to even entertain the notion that these spaces could be repurposed. And I think there's still an opportunity there to do that in the future. And I think to learn from communities that have made the transition, I think one of the things they've done is they've preserved some of their past where they can and used it for the present and ideally for the future.
Yes, Erik is so right there. Like, and as I was listening to that, it makes me wonder if it is like this siloing where people are not sharing like the knowledge, but also it's like this, I don't know, kind of external control that now the current power stations and things, like if we look at Onji, for example, like they've demolished Hazelwood. Where's the sign? Like someone told us where the sign was.
Yes.
But that could be something that could be honoured as a part of our history, but it isn't yet. And I guess we've got like Power Works where they have like a dredger and they've got all their cool historical stuff there. And we also have artists that have made incredible art inspired by industry, but there isn't like a singular kind of place to go and see that. Like I know the Latrobe Regional Gallery has quite a big collection it seems to only pop up from time to time. There isn't like a lot of representation of young people in historical societies, and I think that's like, you know, everyone's in the grind, raising families, trying to get by, and so there isn't like time to stop and smell the history, like, or to feel entwined in that.
That's a great way of putting it. I think his framing of identity as a resource, and that like how you get to the post-industrial future through art, is something that I know we talk about and are like interested in. But the idea of like repurposing the spaces, there are so many cool empty industrial spaces that are just not, and maybe the difference is with what you were just mentioning is like all of those are siloed there. You have to go to them to engage with them, whereas I think a lot of the art or the architecture or whatever is like in places that people go anyway. It like brings the like response into the community. If you were going to do something at the site of Hazelwood, which Hazelwood perfectly lines up with one of the main streets of Morwell, so that there's like a view line. If you stand at the top end of that street, you can look all the way down to where that power station used to be. If they put something there that was like huge visual, like whether it's a light display or I don't know if holograms exist yet, but you could put something there that like spoke to the past but was also able to be engaged with by people who are just going about their day. And again, I think it is the lack of, like you were saying, the lack of a centralized body or like place that is like that's their specific job to heal. We don't really have anybody whose job that is, and so therefore it you know, it's happening in pockets and artists and people are doing good work, but it's not this like really big vision stuff that feels like it would need to happen. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting that like he called that out so specifically and saw that as something that set us apart.
How people view our identity now as like overlooked, and having done all of this work to power the state of Victoria at great cost as well.
Yes.
And there isn't really places for that pride for what we have done.
If there's a way to like imbue, and I think there might be some of that bubbling away, like I know people are working on this type of stuff, but yeah, the fact that other regions are able to get more of that going on, like I know the Hunter Valley region had the Little Works project, and I think there's other stuff going on in Tasmania. The Valley is able to have some of that. Knowing that that's a point of difference kind of explains why some of does feel like this ghost that we're not talking about. We're just walking through it like it's there but it's not there or something. Like you can kind of feel it, but it's not demarked or like processed in any way. It gives it like I don't know, there's a vibe. There's definitely a vibe. That was almost the end of the conversation with Erik, but I like, because he spoke so passionately about his time in the Valley, I had to find out what his favourite building or landmark is.
Gee, that's a good question. Maybe the Churchill monument, which I think, you know, speaks to that modernist, confident progressivism, you know, that sense that we're building a new place, and here's a statement about what it can be. The fact that it was often mistaken to be something else, you know, Churchill's cigar is a sort of vernacular rendering of the original statement, and I like that as well. And people still think of it as Churchill's cigar, but those in the know understand that it was not designed as such. But maybe that doesn't matter. You know, if people engage with these things and they bring their own sensibility to it. But I might be a little biased because, you know, we did live in Churchill and we loved it.
Okay, so the Churchill Monument.
Yes.
Okay, I have made a funny meme about this. I think it's hilarious anyway, so maybe we'll share it on the feed. But I've made a meme of, I can't remember the "This is not a pipe" picture.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah, I made a meme with the Churchill Monument, which certainly looks like a cigar, saying this is not a cigar, which I think is hilarious.
That's
but
brilliant.
What the hell? What is it supposed to be?
I think Erik's saying that it is just supposed to be like this modernist thing about confident progressivism. I mean, it looks like a cigar or a penis if you want to go down that route. It's just like a big yellow pillar in the middle of Churchill. But I do think like that it's kind of open to interpretation, right? The fact that like the town is called Churchill after Winston Churchill, and then they put a fucking cigar shaped monument and then expect us not all to like assume it's that. But yeah, I was wondering, Steph, what's your favorite Valley monument?
Okay, so I've always liked that in Moe we have this big palm tree in one of the roundabouts, and It's just kind of out of place, and I don't know why they freaking grew a palm tree.
Maui's the least tropical place you could imagine. Like,
right?
It's so deeply not tropical. It looks more like South Park than tropics. Yeah. It's distinctly makes me think about the lack of our visual monuments or singular imagery that kind of sums up the area. Like, when we've made films about the region, we struggle to think of one hero still that can kind of sum up what's going on. Right? Which makes me think like we really do have like a lack of iconic visual. Like, you're right, there's like little bits
war
of
monuments. Like,
yeah, in isolation they don't really sum up to like everything that's going on. Morwell wise, is Mid Valley a monument? Like, I guess not really. It's just a place.
It's a monument to me. Kind of a monument.
If there's any architecture students out there who want to create a monument, like, now's the time, because we don't really have one.
We don't have one, and we'd like to film it too.
Yeah, but and we film it. That's a great documentary idea. Someone come and just like create us a better monument, because I'm sure you can outdo the Big Cigar, although the Big Cigar is pretty cool. I want to shout out Erik. He's also just written a new book. It's called Politics, Pride and Perversion, The Rise and Fall of Frank Arkell, and it's about the mayor of Wollongong. It sounds like that book writing process for him took a pretty dark turn. Erik uncovered that there was a gruesome descent into some pretty twisted stuff that Frank was into. So if you want to find out more about that, you can follow Erik on X, aka Twitter. He's Erik Eklund 10. He isn't sure why there's a 10 at the end of his username, but that is the username. Next episode, we're going to be focusing all about power struggles and the rise of the State Electricity Commission. But to close off this story, I wanted to hear from someone who is working in the industry or the wider industry today. I was curious about those who were left behind in the wake of this huge boom, who's still working, as the industry contracts, what's it actually like. The power industry isn't just those literally working in the mines. The town's expanded with the growth and the entire supply chain. So the connected businesses and services that underpin and prop up the function of the power industry, like, what is it like for them? These are the jobs where lay folk, such as myself, have never heard of these roles. They probably feel a little bit invisible, but they're actually crucial to having our lights on. So, Steph, I know that I don't know, did you study economics in high school? Because I definitely didn't. So I was wondering what you think about when I say supply chain.
No, so I certainly did not study economics in high school. That's not my favorite subject. But when I think about supply chain, I kind of thought about the peripheral services like cafes and things, and even like where you go and buy a car, like when you've got big power station bucks to go shopping there.
Yes, that's pretty much it. Basically, like you said, it's the entire network and process of getting energy from its source to the end user, and it encompasses every stage from extraction to generation to consumption. So it would be basically anything that touches the process is like part of the supply chain. So I would say like most of Morwell. Yeah, yep. And the people who service them and the people who build them, cut the wood for them. Like, it's like, again, I don't want to say it's like goes to the top, but it is definitely all connected. To have someone speak to us about that, I reached out to Rob Mizzi, who is the director of Gentech. They're the ones who repair and service the large electric motors and generators that are inside the power industry. Rob is a lifelong Valley resident. This is the story of how he went from an SEC apprentice to the director of a crucial part of the energy supply chain.
So I've lived here all my life. My dad, he worked on construction at Yallourn Power Station. So he was a rigger. So he was involved in building the power station, and then also went on from there to Loy Yang, doing the same thing as on construction. Yeah, I was always interested in the electrical side of the industry. So one way or the other, I wanted to be involved electrically. That was my passion. So I started my apprenticeship in 1980 as a electrical fitter armature winder, and went through the process of, right through the nitty-gritty of coil manufacturing. We did everything as far as electric motors go. And we fixed everything. So every little motor that came in was repaired. So these days we don't do that anymore because it's more viable or cheaper to just buy a new one than what it is to repair them. So coming through the SEC, we always thought we had a job forever, as everyone back in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Once you got employed by the SEC, you thought, well, you can stay here for the rest of your life if you liked. But that didn't turn out to be the way. When the privatisation thing happened with the SEC, our workshop was bought by a German company called Siemens. So I went over to Siemens and worked for them for 10 years. And then Siemens closed the doors. I found myself out of a job for the first time in my life in 21 years and started up Genetech. The power industry has thousands of electric motors in them. We overhaul, repair, rewind electric motors and generators, so to keep the power stations running basically, and not just power stations but the paper mill as well, and we also work in steel industry and water industry as well. The supply chain goes a long way down the track. There's so many levels, even with us, so many other business rely on us to, like bearing shops. We buy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of bearings every year. So, other engineering shops like machine shops that rely on us we give them things to machine up and make new for us if we find a damaged part of a motor. Yeah, it's such a flow-on effect. If we weren't to be here, there's so many other business that would be affected by that as well.
All right, so that is really disturbing that it's more viable and cheaper to buy new and small engines than it is to repair them. That is so the way of the world now. My TV's broken and I have to get a new one. I can't get it fixed, and it's just a pixel. And my dad always complains about this all the time because he learnt to do electronics, so he could repair stuff, and you were able to till the early late 90s. Yeah, everything's just been made so disposably since then. And I think it's really interesting.
More money.
Yeah, more money.
I thought his description of the forever work, to me, all jobs seem temporary, and that we don't have a lot of faith in companies to have our backs, really. The idea that in the 80s and stuff, people were the company's got me and they will take care of me. Can't really imagine. Do people feel that way now? I don't
think so.
Yeah, so there must have been must be real psychological shift for folks to go from thinking oh, this is where I'm going to be and I'm going to make my life around this, which is kind of back to your point about casualization earlier, when we've kind of got this fly in, fly out workforce, or temporary workforce, or expanding workforce that they know is going to contract. It's so hard to build what we would have considered to be kind of a stable family. How do you plan around that? Am I wrong? But union participation is down, right? Since the 80s and stuff, I think, right? People are
definitely
less likely to be. Yeah.
Definitely. So it is a lot down.
Rob actually lived through the end of the SEC and well into privatization, and that's the kind of milieu that he's operating his business in now. So I was curious for him to describe what it was like for an average worker back in the 80s and 90s.
Before the SEC sold the workshop, there was 140 people in that workshop. When Siemens took over, within 6 months they cut that down by half. So they got rid of a lot of people that they seemed they didn't need. And we maintained that probably around 70 people for the 10 years that Siemens had that workshop for. But in that 10 years they did not put one apprentice on. We have 3 first-year apprentices here at the moment. So in the 25 years Genetec's been going, we have put through 12 apprentices.
Yes, this is a story that we hear so often. And I think I may have brought this up in the last episode too, but when my uncle was going through his apprenticeship in the 70s, there was hundreds of apprentices. Now, to hear Rob say that there was 10 years where they didn't put on a single apprentice, no wonder there's kind of a bit of a bottleneck with, even if people want to go into these industries, there's nowhere to take them for the extended part of the training. You can do all the book work and, some of the hands-on components at TAFE, but then what?
Because of this real contraction in the amount of apprentices, places available for them in the first place, there's just a generation or two missing that we would have had if it hadn't not have contracted so badly. So yeah, I know that there are folks again working on trying to replace that, but I the scale at which they have to replace it and have more of that training going on and so quickly to meet the new demands is mind-boggling. So I'm still yet to sort of see how that's all going to come together. But yeah, obviously, let's have some more apprentices. Fucking hell. So Rob's business is at the coalface of the transition to renewables, something he says they're already doing. But he has some concerns about the fact that the components aren't local.
We have started working on renewables such as wind generators, more so than anything else. And that transition has been good. It's been building. We are trying to grow our business with getting involved in many different companies in wind. So the issue we have with wind, mainly with wind now, is because nothing is manufactured in Australia, so most of these machines are coming from overseas. So the problem we have now is they're so cheap to buy, they're not fixing these. These are not small machines. These machines weigh 15 tonne. Even if there's not a lot wrong with them, they are not fixing them, they're just sending them to scrap.
Yeah, I think like Rob is right there that like we are not seeing any of the small parts manufacturing that could be done onshore in Australia for the wind industry happening here. I know there's a lot of people that would love to see that industry taken up in the Latrobe Valley, as it would, provide comparable jobs for folks who have the skills to do that. But unfortunately, like, it is cheaper to manufacture everything overseas. I don't think that is a good thing. And I think that it could fill a lot of gaps in the supply chain workforce here in the Valley if we were to take that on. It would be great to see the council and other people working to try and get some of these small parts manufactured here.
And maybe those jobs could be like really great conditions and like people could build their lives around them or something. Like, I don't know.
Maybe.
So today we learned about the, in quotations, golden age of coal. We asked the question of who's that golden for? And we also learned that it was a little bit gold tinted for some people, steady pay, a brick houses on a hill, warm industrial hot tub, formerly known as the Hazelwood pondage. But for others, it was not such a great experience. Steph, I'm wondering, of all the stuff that we learned, what sort of were your key takeaways?
I guess for me, the key takeaway has been that the casualisation of the workforce is not new.
Yeah.
And that there was, these sporadic contracts for working class people. So I think that's really fascinating. I think also what was mentioned as well about our discussion around the monument, I think that is a really good point, and one that we keep on circling back to in a lot of different work, whether it be film or from the arts lens. But it's really interesting to hear that is kind of what is different from Erik's perspective between our community and a lot of other communities around Australia. And the main thing, I think, for me is that we've been taking lessons from Germany and places around the world for so long.
I was also shocked that collaboration had been so ongoing. But I think I was the most shocked about, honestly, the national parks stuff. Like, I really did not know that we had that environmental history, and I feel kind of like ashamed that I didn't know more about it. So I'm definitely going to put on my reading list to like learn more about the naturalist clubs and stuff like that. Hopefully we'll be able to find some folks to have chats with about it. But yeah, if anyone knows any naturalists, let us know. On next episode, we're going to be looking at power struggles, the rise of the State Electricity Commission and how it shaped everything.
So a big thank you to our guests Erik and Rob for being so generous with your time.
Thanks again to Federation University Australia for supporting this pod.
You can find our resources in the show notes for this episode.
The music for Coalface is by Anonymous 420 and Loyalty Freak Music. The series is written, edited and produced by Josie Hurst and Stephanie Sabrinskas.
We've also set up a Ko-Fi. If you want to support our work with a one-off or recurring donation, you can easily do so. Find the links on our social media. We're on Instagram at CoalfacePod, on Ko-Fi at CoalfacePod, or you can send an email to coalfacepodcast@gmail.com. Look out for the next episode of Coalface.